How do you get into the jewellery business? And if you do, what is your job going to be? And let me tell you, there is actually a lot of different roles that you can do in the jewellery business, or even more specifically in the antique jewellery business, that you probably wouldn't have thought of. My name is Matthew Weldon. Welcome to Gem Pursuit, and today we are going to talk about those roles. Now, it got me thinking after we did our last episode when we talked about, we're talking about the antique jewelry business and the question that we got asked, and a lot of people were interested in different elements of the business. And it kind of made me think about who all the different people in Courtville who we would liaise with on a kind of week-to-week or month-to-month basis, and what their actual jobs are in the business. Because there's actually quite a lot. Every time you pick up a piece or you see it in an auction catalogue or whatever it is, there's been a lot of people who've handled it and researched it and restored it and made it. And I think it's important that we look at these different roles and give you a flavour for what these would be like if you were in that particular job in the antique jewellery business or in the jewellery business, because some of these will actually cross over into the jewellery business at large. So what we're going to do today, right, we're going to go through the different types of careers that you can have, and as I say, give you an insight into each one of these. And starting off, a very important one, we're going to talk about being a jewellery historian or a researcher. The first thing is, if we get a piece in, what happens when we get a piece in is we research it, right? And one of the roles that you have in a jewellery business is the researcher. And that's kind of linked to the cataloguer, who basically, based on their research, will end up writing the catalogued description of the piece. Now, as jewellery businesses grow, what happens is those two roles could become slightly different, and you could also have a jewellery historian. In most businesses, you're not going to have a jewellery historian separate to the researcher or the cataloguer. That just won't happen. But if you get to a certain size, if you're doing a lot of volume or a lot of important pieces, there's certain companies who'd be very heavy on the jewellery historians. Wartski's in London is one I can think of. You've got to have a really strong jewellery history background to even get in the door there. Gemology and goldsmithing, all these other skills would be almost expected, I'd say. But it's your depth and how your research abilities will be key there. For as an example, a piece comes in, it goes to our jewellery researcher, our historian, who would have been me, but as we've grown now, we've got Fenya, who's doing it right now actually, is looking into history of some of the pieces. Now, the path for that, if you're getting into the business and you like that side of it, you wanted to be looking at jewellery, looking up hallmarks, researching them, you'd probably start off as a cataloguer. Junior cataloguer could be in an antique jewellery business, could be in an auction house, could be in a museum. They'd catalogue all the pieces that come in, and your job is basically do some research and then write the descriptions of these pieces. Now, as you learned and you did lots of pieces and you got more experience, you could veer into the jewellery historian path, is when you research in depth the history of certain pieces. That can be where they've been, who's owned them, how they arrived to where they are today, and kind of the story of those pieces. And I guess in a way, for me, a jewellery historian is just a more in-depth version of a researcher who just focuses on the history of the pieces. A researcher in most business is trying to add value to the pieces that are in the business, whereas a historian is a more academic calling than that. But we have one jewellery historian here working with us. So, that's the first stage. That is the first stage. Once we get a piece here at Courtville, that's what we do. We do the history on it, right? Next up, and this is where you move into a different stream, I'd say, of the jewellery business. And it's one that a lot of people think about, is the gemology side of it. If you were going to become a gemologist. And there is lots of different courses you can do on gemology. If you're in the US, you can do the GIA course. If you're in London, you can do the GEMA course. And in Europe, there's lots of different ones as well. Now, a gemologist is somebody who focuses on the stones, on the gems, right? Not a geologist. Geologists focus on rocks, whereas the gemologists focus on the gems, which often are formed within these geological rocks, but specifically the gems that could be used in jewellery. So if you were to get into that area, it's quite technical. So you'll be doing sort of laboratory style testing of gemstones, refractive index tests, specific gravity tests. You'd be assessing them under different types of light. You'd be doing magnification tests to see what types of inclusions are within the stones. I'm taking me back now to my GIA days, using a microscope, but also just using your 10x loupe, which is your standard in the jewelry business. Depending on what area of the business you went into, gemology is typically used for gem identification and then also for grading the stone. So assessing how good the actual stone is. So once you figure out, is this a diamond? Is it a sapphire? Is it a ruby? Then assess, what's its origin and how good it is. So that's your type of gemology roles that you would get. Quite technical, quite scientific, and you'll be using different laboratory equipment. Kind of a road you could go on from there, which actually would take into a bit of the research that we talked about at the start and the gemology. You could become an appraiser or a valuer. Now, there's a big difference between being an appraiser and a valuer and the gemology and the jewelry history. So the big difference between these spheres, once you get into the appraiser valuer, right, is you're talking about the money, right, the value of pieces. A gemologist scientifically looks at what is a stone. How would you assess it? Is the color intense? Is it weak? Is it corundum? Is it synthetic? Is it natural? Is it treated? What's the origin of the stone? Is it Colombian emerald? Is it Zambian emerald? Right? That's what your gemologist will look at. They don't even get involved really in value. Obviously, it impacts value, but the gemologist won't be necessarily looking at the value day to day. And the historian will be able to tell you who owned it, how it's passed through the ages to get to where it is now. But they won't be necessarily focused on value either. The appraiser will be the one who takes these different elements and tries to put a number on it. So they'd be looking at market forces like auction results, private sales, prices in the business, in the antique jewelry fairs, and they will be looking to say, depending on the value, what it's worth. And the values could be valuation for probate, that's in case of inheritance, your net realizable value, like your commercial sales price, what they think you'd get if you actually sold it, and your insurance value. And these are all different types of values. Insurance value is your replacement cost, right? So if you have a piece of antique jewelry and let's say, God forbid, you lose it, you're going to have to replace it. Now, you might have to source lots of different antique stones, which individually are almost impossible to source. Doable, but very difficult. So you'll have to source all of those stones. You might have to source, if there's 10 stones in the ring, you might have to source from 10 different places. That's 10 different shipments. That's 10 different types of insurance for the shipments. Then you'll also have to get a jeweler to hand make the piece, right? So instead of just buying something pre-loved as it is, you have to pay for all these services to get it made exactly as it was. Because if you lose it, you're entitled to have exactly what you had before the loss event. So that's your insurance value. And because of that, it'll be typically higher than the price that you paid for it. Could be, depending on the piece, could be 10%, could be 30%, could be 50%. It just depends. But it's what it would cost you to replace it as is. You'll lose the provenance, obviously. If you have a Marie Antoinette piece and you lose it, you might be able to buy diamonds similar and get it made similar, but it won't be Marie Antoinette's piece. So that will be lost. I mean, that's an extreme example, but the day-to-day of the appraiser, they can work within a jewelry business, or they can have their own separate business. They could work remotely. They can work. A lot of people would have an office though, because they need to keep their equipment in a location, and typically they need to meet people with their jewelry to do the assessments. So they'd be meeting people. They'd be looking at the jewelry. They'd be doing the testing. They'd be doing the analysis. They'd be looking at the historical and the gemological sides and the goldsmithing sides of it. And then they would document this in a legal document, typically photograph it, and then they would produce this document for their client. And I think that it's a really good type of job. You need to have a broad knowledge of sort of all of those elements and also be up to date with the commercial side of it. And so typically your appraiser would be someone who has probably worked in the business for a few years. They might have done their gemology degrees, they might have our qualifications, they could have been a researcher, they could have been a cataloger, they could have worked in retail, they could have worked in an auction house. And after a good bit of experience, they've decided to set up as an appraiser. And I think it's a great idea because it's kind of flexible. It's you don't actually have to buy the jewellery, and you get to see a lot of cool pieces. And some appraisers do get involved in a bit of dealing. So they're appraising pieces and they might say, oh, I know that someone might like this, and they might be able to try connect a sale. So there is a bit of a commercial element to it as well. These different roles, they do attract different types of people too. That's your typical appraiser kind of job. Appraisers do have sort of it can be risky in the sense that they're putting everything down in writing, right? What it is that they've assessed, the results of their tests, and then they assign a value to it. And obviously when you get into values, it can be tricky, right? So it's to do with the type of pieces that appraiser can look at. They can be like if someone inherited a lot of jewellery and they want to get it assessed for insurance, okay, that's fine. Or it can be sometimes that people buy jewellery and then after they bought it, they get an independent appraisal somewhere else. And that's, again, that can be a tricky part because if someone paid, let's just say $5,000 for a piece of jewelry and the appraiser comes out over and says it's worth $3,000, that can lead to difficult scenario. And equally, they could say it's worth $8,000, and that leads to a different conversation then. But my experience of appraisers is that because they're working off replacement cost, because we've dealt in antique jewelry, it's always going to be higher than what is paid for it, because just making jewelry is more expensive than buying it as is, right? But they can get it wrong, and sometimes also certain appraisers are also aligned to certain shops and certain businesses. So sometimes the independence of it, and I'm an auditor by trade. I studied for 4 years as an accountant and an auditor, believe it or not. And the thing about audit that you kind of learn on day one is that you need to be independent and you need to be seen to be independent, right? Which is a different thing. You can be independent, but if the appearances are you're not independent, then you have an issue as well. And the issue with some of the appraisers is that if they do a lot of business with one particular client, you need to be aware that they've got an interest in keeping this client happy, basically. And that can affect the valuations that I've seen from time to time. But then, we've also used other appraisers who are just fantastic, gemologists, jewelry historians, and they can tell you so much about the piece. It's a good role in the business. I think it's one that if you are kind of detail-orientated, methodical, you gotta go methodically through it, but you like that element of like the commerce, values, keeping an eye on prices, an appraiser, valuer is a great role to consider. And you can do it within a business or you can do it by yourself. So moving on to, I'm just thinking of the arc of a piece of jewelry that we'd acquire. So we've researched it. We've looked at the stones. Our gemologists looked at the stones. We've kind of got an indication of value. Now we're moving on to, ultimately, we are a boutique, a shop. We sell jewelry, right? So jewelry has to be fit for the purpose, which is that people want to wear it. And although I try to only buy pieces that are super fresh, and what I mean by fresh, it's an antique jewelry term, is that often in the trade, you'll hear someone say, they're at a counter, they go, oh, that's a nice ring there, Victorian ring, yeah, 1880s, yeah, very fresh piece. They basically mean that hasn't seen a lot of wear. So it's pretty new. And there's those pieces that do appear like that. Someone might have got a present of them in 1880, wore them for a couple of years and put them away, and basically they've been sitting in the safe ever since. And they'd be the fresh pieces. But there's some other pieces that have been worn for 120 years and they need a little bit of restoration. And then you're getting into, you send them into our goldsmiths. And I'm thinking of my cousin, Larry, who does our goldsmith and work. So just thinking of, for those pieces that need a bit of work, they go to the jewellery restoration specialist or the goldsmith, right? And goldsmiths can do lots of different work. They can create pieces, design pieces, or they can be a restorer of antique pieces. And this is moving into a very different field. So you're out of the shop now. You're not in the store. You're not in the office. You're not researching pieces. You're in the workshop. And this is a very different environment. I've been in a lot of jewellery workshops in my time, and I love the atmosphere in a jewellery workshop, but it is completely different to the retail side of the business. Because ultimately they're metal workers, right? Metal and stone workers. So the language can be colourful. Like, they're not fancy places, right? So you go into a high-end jewellery boutique, it's usually well put together, nice carpets, nice floors, nice cabinets, nice lighting, well-presented people. The workshops can be a bit rougher, basically. But that is where the work happens, right? So in that case, it's someone who's going to be really good with their hands, right? You're obviously working with precious metals, so you have to be very precise. If you're working on a piece of jewellery and, you shave a bit too much off a ring, you could lose a gram of gold, which at the moment is sort of 100 odd euro, $120 per gram. So you have to be super, super careful. I mean, that's not even talking about the stones, right? So if you're setting an emerald, one slightly too strong movement, you push a claw too hard down onto an emerald, you can chip the side of an emerald. So you have to be extremely precise, extremely careful, and every single job you do has an element of risk attached to it, which is why, for example, most jewellery businesses would have what they call work-on insurance. So all of our pieces that go to a workshop, if they get damaged in the process, we've got insurance to replace them or restore them or whatever. And that's called work-on insurance. So I'd say, you're goldsmithing, very precise work. Often you're working by yourself for a long, long period of time. There's a bit of a business side to it. You got to manage all your clients, manage their expectations. I'm just also thinking of the jewelers that we work with. It's a big logistical side of it. It's not just the work. So you got to do the work. You got to fix the jewelry. You got to size the ring. You got to do the claws. You got to do the custom design build, all of that piece. But it's also moving all this valuable goods from one place to another, keeping a track of it, making sure that the different people in the workshop get the pieces in a logical format. In the workshops, I think there's usually one person who kind of manages that flow of the goods. And the other people you'll meet in the workshop, you'll meet a setter. Setter is somebody who sets the stones. So once the jewelry is completed and there's no stones, they're the people who actually put the stones into the jewelry. You've got the jeweler who could actually make the ring. You can have finishers who their job is just polishing and cleaning the piece. And then obviously you've got runners. A runner is somebody in a workshop who actually helps with the logistics, moving the pieces back to the shops and back to the jewelry, the workshop, if they're not shipping. And I mentioned there, and this is a slightly different role, and most workshops wouldn't have this, but you'll also get a lapidar or a diamond cutter. Now, there's a difference there. A lapidar is a gemstone polisher, and a diamond cutter just works on diamonds in terms of they just polish diamonds. And you might think that they're two very similar things, but because, as I know our gem pursuiters out there, I know you're very good on your gemology, and you know that diamonds are the hardest natural substance known to man, which just means that you're going to need completely different equipment, and it's just a very, very different thing. So your gem polishing equipment, your lapidar can polish amethyst, corundum, beryl, topaz, agates, you name it. All these gemstones, opals, but your diamond cutter just does diamonds and then needs different equipment to do that. So these guys, these aren't usually going to be in your jewelry workshop. They'll be their own workshop. They'll be the lapidars are the diamond cutters. A couple of lapidars. I know there's one in Dublin and there's one in County Mayo in Ireland that we use. And of course, there's lots of different ones around Europe and the US. Great skill. I think I have such admiration for lapidars. Like the jewelers, it's high risk, I had a stone that I sent to the lapidar here in Ireland. It was a 6.32 unheated royal blue Burma sapphire. Like, Absolutely great stone, oval, looked amazing, really, really beautiful piece. Bit rubbed on the facet junction. So if you think of a stone, you think of the lines, the little angles in it. Over time, they can get a bit worn. And once every 100 years, it's good to refresh those angles. And that's where you send it to the lapidar. So I think to myself, this 6.32 carat Burma sapphire, we really need to keep this over 6 carats. Once you go under 6, it's a 5 carat stone and the value kind of goes down. 6 carat is just better, right? So if it was like the difference between a 6.01 and a 5.99 is a lot, but the difference between a 6.01 and a 6.03 is basically nothing. So it's so important that they keep it over the 6 carats. And sent this Burma sapphire off, and his initial comment to me was, Matt, I'm not going to be able to keep this over 6 carats. I was a bit surprised because this lapidar is fantastic. Like, always does an amazing job. He was just telling me that there was a couple of surface reaching inclusions in the pavilion that, he was worried about when he polishing it. If you can imagine, you're polishing on this wheel and it gets caught and it pulls out little pieces of stone. But I know from dealing with the different jewelers and gem polishers, lapidars, that they'll always overestimate risk. And, we always have a good joke about this. From the shop point of view, we always just say, we send up the job and just say, repolish. Like literally, and Colin's sitting here beside me, and there's never a man I've seen more efficient with his jewellery workshop notes. Apart from him and myself, it's just like fix, repolish, like single word answers, right? But I would say the more detail you give, the better. But this guy, I just said, tell him repolish. He obviously knew he needed to keep it over 6 carats. And in the end, he rang me up and he said he doesn't know about the 6 carat because of the surface reaching inclusions in the pavilion and it's a risky job. Probably a week later, text me, Matt, stone's done, looks great, it's 6.27 carats. And I thought, that's great. But it wasn't cheap now, that job. But it adds a lot of value. This stone now, it was an antique sapphire. It's completely repolished, looks as fresh as the day that it was polished. We lost 0.05 of a carat on a 6.32 carat stone. So incredible bit of work. And this lapidar, you know who you are. Well done. But it's a highly specialized. If I was thinking of the type of person who would like being a lapidar, you'd want to be very, very methodical, very kind of slow in a way. Never a more accurate phrase than measure twice, cut once, I think, is, the way a lapidar has to think. If you're quite scientific, you have to look at the stone, look at the angles, look at what's going to work, what's going to make the stone perform, and then weigh it up against the risk. Are there any potential risks here? Is there surface reaching inclusions? That's a risk. Also creativity, I think, and just a good eye, as we mentioned in our recent Jewel Geek episode. Good eye. A lapidar has to see what that stone is going to look like. They have to be able to visualize how it'll look beautiful. And then they have to technically translate that into a cut on the stone. I actually did one course in lapidary myself once in Col Van Cleef in Paris. And I would say we got given a synthetic piece of corundum. It was just like a little slice of corundum. I think from memory it was an oval kind of slab. It was like a cylindrical slab of sapphire. And we had to polish this into a very basic gemstone shape. And it was a 2-day course. And that was just for a basic one that was synthetic. So there was no risk attached. And I tell you, I had a great respect for the lapidars. The time it took and the attention to detail to get the high polish on the stones was an eye-opener. And I'm definitely glad I did it. So yeah, that's your stone cutter, your lapidar. Most people start off this as a hobby. Then they figure out if they really like it, then it can move into kind of a commercial enterprise. If you could find someone who could be your mentor and train you in this as kind of an apprenticeship, that would be great. But this is a dying trade, and it's sorry to say it's very hard to find good lapidars. And most of the ones that we use will be getting on in age a bit. And it's just, I think there's a bit of a dearth of them. The jewellery business really needs more lapidars. And there are certain places that are doing courses to train more, but they are few and far between. Very few lapidars. The risk here is if you don't have a supply of good lapidars, your high value stones, like what are you going to do with them? Anytime we get a new lapidar who comes in the shop saying and is offering the services, we'll start off giving lower value stones just to make sure that the standard of the work is good. Because you take that 6.3 carat Burma sapphire, if an inexperienced lapidar worked on that and accidentally caught a piece of the pavilion and a little bit of the sapphire popped off, and they had to polish it down and ended up being a 5.5 or a 4.9. The loss in the value is, like, sapphires of that value can be, depending on color or clarity, could be anywhere 5 to 25,000 a carat for a Burma at that quality. Like, I mean, going from a 6 to a 5, you might think, oh, that doesn't sound like too much, but it could be the difference between 80 and a $120,000 stone or euro stone. So it's really important. New lapidaries, we'd give them your quartz stones, let them practice on a couple of our quartz stones to repolish. Lower risk. If they look really good, you move them up to maybe some aquamarines, some sapphires. Emeralds is risky to repolish. If you have a fine opal, highly risky. But a good lapidar is a very big asset to an antique jewellery business and a great person to know. I know we have a great lapidar here, and we definitely do our best to make sure we keep them happy. So yeah, we've talked about, researching the stone, assessing the gems, the actual jewellery work that's required, and, the work on the actual restoring the stones then if required. And I think the next part, that's all kind of one side, and we move on to the next side is really your movement and your acquisition of the stones and what type of jobs you can get around that, right? So, antique jewellery dealer. We touched on this in one of our recent episodes, and we are, as an antique jewellery dealer, you're a professional sifter. Your job is to go through all the vast amount of jewellery for sale, and there is a lot of jewellery for sale in the world, believe it or not, right? And then your job is to go through it and pick out the few nice antique pieces. That's it. And it sounds simple, but it's incredibly difficult. On average here in Courtville, I would say we would look at between 3,000 and 4,000 pieces of jewellery a week, I would say. Between all the online catalogues, between the pictures, between the emails we get sent in with people looking to sell, the WhatsApps that I get, there's about thousands of pieces every week. How many pieces do we buy a week? Depending on the week, I suppose. But, on average, I'd say we're buying 1% to 2% of the pieces that we'd see. If even that, I'd say it could even be less. So it's a huge volume of work of filtration. So you're constantly analysing the pieces. You need a very analytical mind. You've got to work very quick. It's very important. You have to be able to make decisions very quickly. And if you're good at it, it could be very satisfying. It's a great feeling. If you, one of the most enjoyable things I'll have is if I'm looking at, say, a private collection or a big sale or something like that. And I know a lot of people have seen it. And I see one thing that I know that everybody's missed. And you get it, you buy it, and you look at it, and you do your gemological test. You send it to the jeweler, get it restored. You do your jewellery history piece on it. And it turns out to be a great piece. It's a great feeling that your judgment was correct. I think that's one of the most satisfying pieces of being a dealer. And then selling it to someone and getting them enjoying it. I think that's also right up there. Like, I really love it when the clients that we're dealing with really love the antique jewellery. Like, and anyone who's been in us will tell you, you could be there for 2 or 3 hours. We'll just be talking about antique jewellery for that long. And, at the end of it, nothing's even purchased. We're just happy to talk about it. And I guess the other side that you can go on, if you previously were thinking gemology, you're thinking, I kind of like a gemologist. The other road you could do if you become a very astute gemologist, and you also have a good head for numbers and for commerce, you could be a stone buyer. And I'd see these at all the antique shows that I do, especially in the US, the Miami Beach Antique Show, at the New York show that I do, the Jewelry Objects and Antique Show, which we will be interviewing Konstantinos, who organises that very soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that one. That will be a great interview, and we're looking forward to it. Stone buyers are interesting. They're just literally looking at the stones. They don't care about the jewellery whatsoever. In fact, the jewellery is a nuisance because, for example, if I'm selling an antique piece of jewellery, I'm kind of valuing the whole piece. They're really just looking at the stone. It's just an expense for them, the jewellery. They kind of have to buy it because I'm not going to sell just the stone out of it. So often what you'll hear with stone buyers, they'll come up, this is what I experienced anyway, they'll come up to the stands and they'll say, any Burmas, any Kashmirs, any cat's eyes. They're the ones that seem to be popular. Cat's eye chrysoberyls, important stones, old cut diamonds. They really like these stone buyers. But of course, there's stone buyers in all elements of the market, but that's the ones that we'd come across. What you could expect day to day is you'll be doing a lot of sorting to begin with. So you probably get a whole parcel of gemstones. You might get a parcel of rubies, and you have to, it literally could be a bag, like a bag of rubies that could all broadly look like the similar color, but you have to separate them into like the same color, like the reddish reds, the purplish reds, the pinkish reds, and then subdivide those into the other colors so they can be set in kind of more similar jewellery. And then as you move up, you move into more important stones. And then ultimately, I suppose you'd be dealing with the top end of the market would be the trajectory for that. But I think it's an interesting side of the business. You can definitely get big wins in it if you're really good. But equally, there's risks attached to it. And one phrase that we used to have in the shop is there used to be a dealer who'd come into us, and he was a bit of he was halfway between an antique jewellery dealer and a stone buyer. And we always used to say he was chasing the cashmere dragon, because every single sapphire that I had, he goes, God, that looks like cashmere to me. It is a thing that you'll hear, oh God, such and such found a really good cashmere sapphire. And it does happen, but there's a certain type of basaltic material, basaltic being Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, where you can get sapphires. There's a certain type of sapphire that comes from that area that has this velvety texture that you see in cashmere that is often confused for cashmeres. So yeah, stone buyer, good, exciting. You want to be really into the gemology side because you're going to be dealing with rocks all day. So now we're going to move on to the cold, hard face of commerce. And this is where the jewellery is kind of sold, right? And there's three main ways, I'd say, right? There's public sales, which would be your kind of auctions. And then there's private sales, which would kind of be in your retail or dealers. And then there's a B2B side of it, which is there as well, which is kind of why I said there's a third, right? But that's a bit different again. But let's just talk about the public market for the start. Now, I used to work in an auction. My brother and my sister are auctioneers, jewellery auctioneers. So I used to work there when they set it up. Interestingly enough, their first auction was on September 9/11, on that exact day. So it's always an easy one to remember. And I remember being there that day. And it's always a nervous thing when you set up a business. And I remember the first lot came up. We had spent the last couple of weeks getting the shop ready. And I can tell you, anytime you go into a new shop, you always assume that they've had it 100% ready. But often you'll find that in a new business, the paint is barely dry on the wall before they're trying to trade, because it's so expensive to set up a business that you nearly need to be trading straight away. You can't wait for the paint dry and then get the right table and then get this. You just got to start trading, right? But I remember we painted the ceiling black, right? And the theory was that a black ceiling would make it seem higher for some reason. That didn't work at all. That was really a terrible, terrible idea, right? But I do remember painting the ceiling black. Another thing I remember, the builder put down a bottle of Fanta Lemon, which was a lemon fizzy drink, beside a bottle of white spirits a couple of days before we opened. And he just picked up his bottle, opened it, took a sip, and I just remember he spat it all over the floor. And he picked up the bottle of white spirits. And I don't know if white spirits are universally called white spirits, or if there's another name for them, but it's very highly toxic. Now, I didn't understand why at that time it was so dangerous, because I was quite young. But yeah, and looking back, I was like, oh my God, that guy was so lucky. He could probably should have gone to hospital. But we opened up that auction. So, and I worked there for a good while at the start. And my mum worked there for a long time as well, and my brother and my sister. So very familiar with this space. And what auctioneers do, right, is they consign, or they borrow pieces of jewellery from dealers and some from the public, and they catalogue them. So you're getting your researcher, you're getting your gemologist to do some work, and they put on estimates, what they think it's going to sell for. They put this information into a catalogue, and then the catalogue, they have some days where you can go and view the goods. They're called viewing days. In French, they're called expositions. And that's when members of the trade, members of the public can go on and actually assess the pieces in hand. And then there's an auction day. And the auction day is usually go in person to bid. And that's the classic, stick up the hand. Yeah, I bid. Or you can do it online where you can, just click bid, etc. Right? Auctioneers, you'll find typically they'll have monthly auctions or they'll have quarterly auctions. That some of the big auctioneers have biannual ones, right? So it's a big thing. The jobs in auctions, you typically start off as a cataloger or an assistant, and ultimately there'll be gemologists there, there'll be valuers there, there'll be specialists in different areas, and then there'll be auctioneer, and the auctioneer is the person who actually runs the auction. Auctioneers are a great way to buy and sell jewellery. I think private dealing is better, but I think auctions definitely have a lot of positives. You can pick up things at good prices sometimes. On the flip side, sometimes you can get carried away and pay too much for things. And it's exciting to attend an auction. It's great to see the goods. In terms of the work, it's a high volume. There's a lot of jewellery. So there could be, in a monthly auction, there could be 500 lots. So you got to catalogue 500 lots a month. And I have great respect for auctioneers when they do this, because I know how difficult it is to actually catalogue and photograph pieces. And they're just doing such huge volume. It's just like a conveyor belt. They're just moving through it. You got to be very careful with your descriptions. That's what you'll be held accountable to, is how you describe it in the catalogue. But the main difference, I suppose, for the public is that auctioneers are buy as is. You're buying that piece as you see it. There's no guarantees, no warranties, no nothing. You buy it as is. So caveat emptor sort of a thing. It'd be very structured. As I said, it is a conveyor belt, so it'll be kind of a quarterly or monthly process to get this auction together. There's good creativity needed in putting together the catalogue. I think it's a great business for people who are interested in jewellery to at least do a stint at an auction house at some point. Now, the other way you can go is the private market. So private market could be dealers, could be wholesalers, could be boutiques, right? And even in there's all sorts of loads of different roles that can exist. Your dealers, which is, we're kind of halfway between a dealer and a boutique, right? We've kind of got both, right? We obviously have a shop Courtville Antiques is a retail shop. You can go into Courtville. We've got a website, which we're going to be redoing soon, by the way. Watch this space. The website is www.courtville.ie. So, Courtville, we kind of cross over and do a bit of both. Obviously, we've got a retail shop, which is the main crux of it. We're also a dealer, so we will buy and sell things that don't even go onto the market. If we get something in that we know we have a client for, we'll message the client directly and we'll say, listen, we've just got this in. These are the details. We know you've seen that you've indicated you might want something like this in the past. We'll send them photos, specs, and we'll deal that way. The difference with us in the shop is the stuff is laid out and people kind of walk by, or they go onto the internet on our website or on socials and they'll see them there. So we've got those two kind of elements to it. So we're kind of at both. And I guess a lot of the roles will be transferable between auction house and a private market dealer, because the cataloging can be similar, the photography can be similar, the dealing with the clients is similar. There's differences, okay, because in a private market, you have a higher level of expectation, right? Legally, you have to give warranties, you have to stand over the goods, you have to size them, repair them. You come under consumer law, so there's a much higher expectation, which is why when I'm selling to collectors and enthusiasts, that's what I'm really passionate about. And I think for me, it's a better way if you're buying jewelry to do it privately. But we also do a little bit of B2B, because we obviously get offered some great stuff, which we just don't have clients for. And I know shops that do. In a similar way, we'd say, listen, shop A, I say, we just got in this piece, we think it might be for you, what do you think? And they either say yes or no. If they don't like it, we keep it in our own stock. For us, we always buy it. I don't appro anything, because my belief is that if you're approing things, it means that either A, you don't 100% believe in it, which is then why should you expect somebody else to buy it off if you won't put your money where your mouth is? And secondly, or else it's too much for the business to support, in which case you're dealing at a level that you're not at yet. So like I'd say that in the shop, before you have a 2-carat stone, you need to have 10 or 15 1-carat stones. And then you get up to 2 carats, and then you build up your 2-carat, and then you build up your 3 carats. Like you can't just go from 1 carat and buy like a 15-carat stone. It just would stick out, just wouldn't be right. If anyone isn't sure, because there is different words for this in different markets, I say appro. Appro to means you borrow something from someone. Very simply, borrow. A dealer that I know in London might say to me, come over, Matt, do you want to appro 20 pieces of jewellery for the weekend? Which means that they lend them to you, they give you the prices, then you try sell them for them. But some people call that on memo. They could call it SOR, sale or return. Different words, but they all simply just mean to borrow. But we don't do that. I've tried it before, once or twice, but I've kind of arrived at the conclusion that it's just not the way that we want to do business. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but I don't think it's optimum for us anyway. Now, there's a section of jewellery industry jobs that I'd like to talk about now. And these are the ones that I find really interesting because those are kind of the main jobs you get in your traditional jewellery business. But there's an emerging field, I think. If you want to get into the jewellery business, there's other elements that you can look at, right? First off, we're on a podcast here. You can be a content creator for jewellery and you don't even have to buy anything, right? And the thing about being in a jewellery business for what we do, it's capital intensive, right? We're buying a lot of jewellery and we're buying it because we think we get better value, which means we can sell it better. But a lot of the fun in the jewellery business is just looking at the jewellery and researching it and analysing it and sharing it with people. Like, as I said to you, we'll have someone in the shop sometimes for 3 hours. And we will literally just shoot the breeze about jewellery with them. Now, we wouldn't do that all day, every day, because ultimately we wouldn't have a business. But we often do it, right? Especially if the person's really into jewellery. And I love talking to people who are into jewellery. And if anyone actually who listens to this, and I'm sure you do love jewellery if you're into this, if you have any good stories, just send them over to us in experts@courtville.ie, because we'd love to hear from you and hear your jewellery stories and why you love jewellery so much or what interests you about it. Because it's so personal that it appeals to different people in different ways. And I'd love to hear from you on that. Back to content creator. I know there's a few people I go to and they go to all the different antique jewelry shows. They go to different stores, they go to different auctions and they do videos and they do vlogs and they do different things like that. And that content, you typically put it on Instagram or they put it on TikTok or they put it on YouTube and it's generating an interest. And then obviously they're getting paid, I'd imagine, to do these videos, or they're getting referrals or advertising revenue or something like that. So content creator, I mean, who would have thought a content creator could have been a job, and it can be one in the jewellery business, and it is a great way to get into it. A lot of these big shows, a lot of these big jewellery shows, if you're got a bit of influence, they'll pay you to go to an antique jewellery show and to do some content. I mean, what better way to go to an antique jewellery show, do some content, see the jewellery, meet people, go out for a couple of nice dinners, or if you do what I do when I go to an antique jewellery show, I always go to Soul Cycle, which I think is just a great experience, but we won't get into that. Content creator, I would say that's a great way to get into it. And I think outside the box a little bit in terms of, there's a journalistic aspect or an author aspect to it there, because jewelry is high value, it's very specific, it's a lot of technical knowledge needed. So you could be thinking long form content, kind of a journalistic aspect to your content creation, I think could be really good. There's people who are just journalists who specialize in the jewelry industry. Melanie Abrams, who did the article on Gem Pursuit in the New York Times. There's Eleanor Flagg. There's Sylvia Thompson. There's other people who are specialized in both the antique and jewelry side of things. So I think if you like writing, if you've got that kind of creative streak there, that's definitely one way of doing it. There's archivists, and that would probably be within a company who, again, if you're good at that writing, you can archive. If you're detail oriented, you can archive the pieces that they sell or help assist with their old archives. And then also one element that we didn't talk about yet is people who work in museums, public interest kind of job, curator, assistant in the museum. And jewelry is so great as a museum exhibit. I know as a team here, we've gone to see a few different jewellery exhibits. We've gone to the Louvre, the Gallery Apollon, which we did an episode on, which of course was famously broken into there recently enough. There's the Smithsonian, there's the V&A, there's the Muséum des Arts Modernes in Paris. There's some great roles around curation. And again, that goes back to the jewellery historian piece that we talked about at the start. And I think if you're very into the academic side of it, that would be a road you could think about. And before we finish up, there's one role that we haven't really talked about. And I guess it's not typically on our radar because we don't really design pieces. We deal in fine old jewellery. But all of those old pieces were designed at one point. We've done a series, in fact, we did a whole series on some of the great lady jewellery designers of the 20th century. Your Alma Peel of Fabergé, Susan Bell Perron, Elsa Peretti, John Toussaint. We did a season of those, but ultimately jewellery designers are a really fundamental part of the business, and they're designing the fine antique jewellery of the future. And one thing that people always ask, why do you deal in antique jewellery? And the reason I do is that I find overall antique jewellery is just of a higher standard, better design, better made, better stones. But if there was fine modern jewellery, we're totally open to dealing that. We just want to deal in fine jewellery. Now, we do like the historical element of it a lot as well, to be fair. But the fine modern makers are key people in the jewellery business. And if you have a real flair for design, for fashion, coupled with making it into a piece of jewellery, which means that you have to wear it, it has to be worn. And that's what is the key thing. It's worn all day, every day. So it has to be wearable. And if that is your calling, and I remember again in Van Cleef, I did a course on gouache, which was actually painting jewellery, which is a bit of jewellery design. It's very exciting, it's very creative, it's a real process. That is another road you could do. It wouldn't really be in the antique jewellery side of things. It would be more in the modern jewellery, but it is definitely a key part of the jewellery business that I know a lot of people would have an interest in. So look, that's an overview, and it is a crash course. We could probably talk about each of those roles for an entire episode by itself, but we just want to give an overview, a flavor for like what's the pros of each role, like the risk, the difficulties, the challenges, also the excitement and the different paths that you could go inside the jewellery business. And I guess we really leaned on the antique jewellery business there a bit more. But if anyone has any questions, and especially if you're sitting at home there and you're listening to this and you're really thinking about making the jump, and I get a few people come up to me at some of the antique shows we do, and we just talk about, they're thinking about getting into the business. Look, I'd love to have a chat with you. I'm really obsessed with antique jewellery and with the business of it, because I'm really passionate about getting it out to more people. It's still a very niche market. Like, modern jewellery is a multiple the size of the antique jewellery business, but I really think that everyone should be buying antique jewellery, really. So the more people get involved with it, I think it's great. So if you do have any questions or you're thinking about making the leap, just shoot us an email, experts@courtville.ie, or get onto our Instagram @GemPursuitPod, or the Courtville Instagram @Courtville Antiques, and let us know. And don't forget, we're on TikTok as well @Matthew.Weldon. And I'd just like to thank Colin Weldon today for setting up our beautiful studio that we've got. It's a work in progress. We're going to be changing it every week. I think you'll see something different. So thank you, Colin, very much for that. Thank you to Ross Hannon of Tape Deck for producing this episode. And most of all, thank you to you for listening. So I think it's clear from today that no matter what your skills, what your strengths, what your weakness, what your interests are, there is a place for you in the antique jewellery business. And I, for one, really love it, and I would definitely recommend you taking the leap. But for now, from me, your host, Matthew Weldon, in the interim, it's happy hunting.